Good afternoon. I am part of Sam and Kat's group, and we will be talking about the Fluxus art movement. Okay, so what is Fluxus? Fluxus, by definition, was an international interdisciplinary community of artists, composers, designers, and poets during the 1960s and 1970s who engaged in experimental art performances which emphasized the artistic process over the finished product. So there was a lot of focus on making sure that artists were innovating, practicing, experimenting, playing with what they knew best, their materials, their mediums, rather than focusing on what would be the finished outcome. This movement actually provoked a lot of community and collaboration between artists. There was a lot more, almost, I want to say, there was a lot more happening between and among artists than there was with the singular artist. And it's fairly amounted to the fact that it's coming from the Dada art period. Um, it was very much influenced by music and performance as well, as you'll see later on. The important part is also that fluxus is a Latin word meaning flowing, and in English it translates to flowing out. So we all know, like a stream, experimentation can always flow. The title also comes from the first attempt at getting a magazine out by Machina, who wanted to create this magazine for a cultural club in New York. The attempt didn't go as planned, so he made sure that Fluxus still lived on. It's important to also know that Fluxus had a lot of artists who took comedic approaches to their creative practices, and we will see a few of those later. Also inspired by the Dada art movement. So our founder is George Machinas. He is someone who studied at the Cooper Union School of Art, Carnegie Institute of Technology, the Institute of Fine Arts at New York University for around a total of 11 years. And he mainly studied architecture, art history, graphic design, and musicology, all important aspects that came about when he was exploring the idea of creating Fluxus. So during this time, 1963, he created his manifesto. And we know that a manifesto is usually a set of rules or like practices that you want to go by when being in a certain field. And this was for Fluxus itself. So two of the segments that I highlighted, but the most important being purge the world of bourgeoisie sickness, intellectual, professional, and commercialized culture. Purge the world of dead art, imitation, artificial art, abstract art, illusionistic art, mathematical art, purge the world of Europeanism. I said that weirdly, sorry. But all of these statements in one figure of speech relate to the idea of how we need to get rid of the definition of what art is and has to be. So with Fluxus, he proves to push the boundaries of really excavating more of an exploration rather than a result. And that is what the whole Fluxus movement tries to do, is remove the definition of what art has to be. It's also important to know that during this time period, museums had a lot of defining factor on what was in and out. And the Fluxus was trying to basically combat that idea that the museums knew what defined art because that wasn't their appeal to it or like their outlook at it. The focus was set on challenging who and what determined what was considered art. So this is why they did challenge those museums. Um, it's also a very nice attribute that George Machina started to implement these cooperatives houses. So in the Soho areas, they were called Flux House Cooperative. And the first one was made to really give a space for artists to come to live in and really create without restrictive boundaries. They were allowed to really fully express themselves and flourish in their art forms. And you would see artists like Hurley Schneeman all in these areas. After seeing the success of the first cooperative, he decided to get a second. So after buying all these houses, these plans, these floor plans and things like that to really make a space for artists, he decided to make Flux House Cooperative 2. But this space was made more for performative artists like Hurley Schneeman and Joko Ono. So these were more performative spaces rather than spaces of just creating. When I think of Fluxus, I always think back to Dada, but we and I primarily think of Duchamp's The Fountain. I think this is a phenomenal piece where we take something that is out of the ordinary and we just place it and give it a new life. And although it doesn't make sense, it makes sense. Right, so it's an art form inspired from the motivations of the futurist Dada and surrealist artist ideals. Dada came about from the brutality of World War One. So we knew that people were trying to express and create new ideas of thinking. Um, what I have to the right is Maurizio Catalan's Comedian, which is just simply a banana duct taped to a wall during the years of 2019. He was a conceptual artist who took comedic approaches to like creating, and this is where the comedy comes in. Although this time period is a lot later than Fluxus, it gives us a sense of what Fluxus was really determining is that exploration of what creates art and really redefining the idea of what art has to be. Now, this banana brought a lot of controversy because it sold for $120,000. And during this time, people were trying to figure out, well, then what really identifies what art is? And this is where Fluxus comes in. Fluxus is trying to break those boundaries and say that it's more about the process of creating the thinking and what's happening during that moment of creation rather than the end result of that banana being placed there. Now, some of your key artists of the Fluxus movement, your major key artists are Joko Ono, Carolee Schneemann, my favorite, Robert Morris, Joseph Beuys, Yayoi Kusama, Alan Capral, Walter de Maria, George Machinas, John Cage, Nam June Pike, George Brecht. Now, John Cage will be someone we will be talking about extensively as he wasn't a painter or a media composer. I'm sorry, mixed media artist. He was more of an American composer, theoretician, and writer who really played with the idea of melodies and how we can play with the concept of scores. Now, in the two images to your right, you see Cage preparing a piano in 1947, where he took nails and really started to like intertwine the strings of the piano just to give it that strength. But it's something that we're not used to seeing. And I think that's where the practice comes in, seeing how that works and how the melodies play out once he's fully set. You also have 4 foot 33 inches, which is a giant man sitting upon a tiny little piano. And it's all about the experience and the moment and what's happening and how this person is interacting with this instrument. So he was someone who worked during the abstract expressionist era, and I think this is where a lot of that music engraving comes in. Note to self that statement towards the bottom, I think, was of true inspiration to Fluxus. Sorry for going back, but it says the first question I ask myself when something doesn't seem to be beautiful is why do I think it's not beautiful? And very shortly, you discover that there is no reason. So thinking about the process rather than trying to figure out why the end result isn't how you wanted it. Machines organized the first official Fluxus event at the AG Gallery in New York in 1961. The gallery was a success and it brought up a lot of changes. It's so that it became more of an international practice. So Fluxus really spread worldwide into like Germany, Japan, and it really gave people a way to not only experiment but collaborate with new people, really expanding the world of art. The Fluxus art movement started to gradually die out when Machina died in 1978. So the 1970s was a rough time because they didn't have someone who was really pushing the boundaries for what Fluxus should really shape out to be. But who are we to say what Fluxus should be when they're fighting so hard for it not to be labeled? The movement is perhaps most famous for its events, its performance pieces, and I think this is where we really see the emphasis of what Fluxus is becoming and was. That whole push for really redactifying what anti-art meant to be, right? We see Yoko Ono in this cut piece where she sets a set of rules for people to grab scissors and cut a piece of her clothing. And it's a moment where it can go unexpected, but that is where this artist is placing themselves in the moment, experiencing what the possibilities are, thinking about the process and what can be, not what will be. We also see to the right Curly Schneeman, interior scroll. She approached a wide table and had dynamic poses happening. But while this was happening, she was also pulling out an interior scroll from her insides. Um, Not her insides, but her area down there. This thin scroll she then read from. And during this process, she was not so much thinking about what was happening, but she was taking her time in deciding what her next steps would be. Um, this was definitely a feminist approach, as this presentation was primarily done for women artists. These are my resources, and please enjoy the rest of the presentation.